Good morning, everybody. This is Steve Attarian. I am here with Dr. Stephen Wilson. We are here today to talk about some of the biblical principles of eating, how the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Proverbs how to eat better. And Dr. Stephen Wilson is my guest, and he is an expert in a lot of things. He's a naturopath and a very modest gentleman, you'll notice as he speaks today. But we're going to discuss some of the better ways to eat that our Creator gave us as a basis to be healthy and strong and vital and to be good servants. So with that introduction, Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wow. Well, let's first define expert. It is simply a drip under pressure.
Aha.
So thank you for the niceties. So if we could, why don't we start off, since this is kind of an interesting topic, Socrates writing in the Republic 5 BC, if you will, 500 BC-ish, he asked the question, how should man live? And if we jump forward a number of thousands of years, Francis Schaeffer asking the same question, how then should men live? And he published a book, that title. And my position, how I began my story was in literally looking at the restoration of what I had done to my own body by disobedience to the biblical truths and laws of eating. And we first need to understand that they're not laws, but they are instructions, and you can choose to do them or you can choose not to do them. And that's how I started mine. And so if I were just to talk about the principles for just a moment, in Proverbs it talks about, I want you to be intelligently disciplined. That is an interesting, and I take my most of my work comes from a Jewish Bible. So, you know, the dialogue and the words are just a tad bit different. I think they're a little more forceful. So if I'm going to be intelligently disciplined, and for what reason, and it is to be first right. Isn't that interesting? I want you to be right. And then I want you to be just, and I want you to be fair.
Right, just, and fair.
Right, just, but first you want to be right. If you're not right, then you obviously can't be just. Mm-hmm. So it's within that configuration that you could leap forward into a little further on in Proverbs. It talks about common sense. And it says, if you're not walking in common sense, you're literally walking with the dead, or in our case, dying.
It doesn't say walking with politically correctness?
No, it's common sense.
Common sense.
Common sense. Okay. So the common sense then would come out in such language as, is it organic or is it inorganic? Do you believe that you could do inorganics in your body? Is that common sense to go out and get a hold of a rock and start chewing on it? There's no common sense in that.
And just to clarify, inorganics meaning something that's dead, enzymatically dead, yep, versus enzymatically alive, organic. So the real word of organic, or one of the definitions of it, is to be alive. Here today we're exposed to a lot of organic things, which means no pesticides, raised organically. Really, we're referring to alive items, especially for a digestive tract.
Especially for the digestive tract. So if you don't mind, Steve, we could carry off into, we generally speak in terms of the physical side of health, you know, what we put in our mouth, but the instructions scripturally in diet, we should really maybe talk about what you look at, what you listen to. Mm-hmm. Does that affect your diet? Does that affect your overall physiology? And I'm afraid that as we forget the purity of listening to good music, of observing good things, that affects the emotional side of eating. And when you begin to cause that kind of stress is the number one cause of free radical activity or toxicity to the body. And it's from that medium that we begin to really decay in a rapid way. And you sent me a video, which I haven't seen, but you touched on it briefly, about the gut And what we really need to understand as a culture is that 70% of your immune system is created in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And there are approximately about 500 forms of bacteria in the gut. And they're dealing with this compost pile that you've built up in there.
That's a great terminology.
Well, it can be very, very ugly. And all at once, the studies that come out of this, we cannot say it too many times, that depression is originated in part in the digestive tract.
Mm-hmm.
So if this thing is not functioning, your immune system is compromised and you're dealing with depression. And
many other maladies.
Oh, geez, yeah, they just go on and on. Well, if your immune system is harmed, and we begin to deal with this thing called immunosenescence, meaning the death of the system that is your immune system, the death of the cell. Senescence is that, science creates some pretty interesting words, but when you begin to kill these cells, you begin to kill the mechanism that protects you. So if we dealt with that, the first system that shows or is an indicator that you have an issue with your immune system is the respiratory system. So if the respiratory system is compromised, you begin to deal with what?
Lack of energy, lack of oxygen, lack of expelling bad things from our system.
Hay fever, all of these things that people are suggesting that they're having an issue with. Well, why would it not be an approach to put something in your body, lactobacillus, as a reminder, to begin to stir that mess up and begin to reverse this? The idea here is about 80% good bacteria and 20% bad. And right now in America, it's about 80% bad and 20% good.
Mm-hmm.
So if we began to feed those critters that were such incredible workers to right this terrible wrong that has such an impact on our emotional and physical well-being, because as we become problem physically, it affects us emotionally.
Absolutely.
So then that turns that little cycle into a real mess, and we begin to go to the very source of the problem that creates it, which is sugar. And this sugar is gonna penetrate everybody's life, and it is a diligent. It is a difficult matter because it is in everything in the world that we live in, because of the convenience, because of the effect it has on us. So
because of the flavor it adds to get people to continue buying and eating. The companies that make these things want to sell their products. It's not, bad or evil in any way, but they need to sell products to stay in business, to employ their people. And if you eat something that tastes blah or bland or doesn't have a little bit of zing to it, you might not buy it again. And we look at these kids' cereals, and they are, so high in sugar content that the second and third ingredient is just sugar. And then the first ingredient is a processed dead flour that our body interprets as sugar and processes as sugar. And I think that sugar is some of the names of sugar: high fructose corn syrup, dextrose, sugar cane syrup, dried sugar cane. There's all kinds of different names on the back of the label that doesn't say sugar, but it's sugar.
Brown sugar. Everybody looks at brown sugar and says, this is good. All they do is take refined sugar and put molasses in it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are so many ways of doctoring up and misleading. It really should be termed the theater of science. And we all know that theater is just an act.
Well, and science, continually changes. The new information overrides the old information. We get better and better instruments to test with, but it's all based on the hypothesis. What do you want this data to tell us? The data is the data. The data is correct and honest and forthright. but it's what questions do we ask of the data? What assumptions are we making? You know, we made the assumption in the 50s that fat was causing our high rate of heart attacks in America, that all these other countries that had longer lifespans and lower rates of heart attacks had low-fat diets, so that must be the solution. Well, that was the science of the day. The science we have now is more than, and we're able to look into the blood, and we're able to look at a lot of things that tell us, you know, that candida, funguses, red blood cells. We're able to look at red blood cells and see the health of them. So sugar, I apologize, I keep, you know, where does sugar come in the Bible? Those, you know, I know that several places Solomon mentions in Proverbs honey, and he says honey is good. A
little different type of sugar.
And the honeycomb is good for the body and the soul. But then he says don't eat too much honey because it'll make you sick, it'll make you vomit. And then he goes on to say, you know, don't go into your neighbor's house too often, or he'll be sick of you. So you know,
it makes you stay short.
I do think that there's wisdom in both of those. You know, that having something that does give you, you know, some high. So what I'm looking, high fructose corn syrup, the energy the sugar gives us.
Well, it's a chemical.
You know, but honey is also, I mean, honey is, everything's made up of chemicals. Everything's made up of molecules.
Well, there's a difference between a natural. Okay. But you're talking about a couple of different things, you know. It's, when you deal with honey, I think that Solomon is genuinely speaking of a little bit of this goes a long way. And you know, a little bit of honey makes the medicine go down, something to that effect.
No, it's a spoonful of sugar.
That's it. Scripturally, it's honey.
You know, in England at the time, they had a lot of sugarcane farms.
Yeah. Here again, you just lurch forward a couple thousand years to when Paul was running around the culture, and he said, I have to beat my body into submission, which is an interesting thing because obviously he fought with the same thing that we fight with, and that is discipline. So if we could but for a few minutes discuss how we could make that work. You know, and I really believe that after reading a number of Harvard studies and bits and pieces that the business world has shown is that we are kind of responsible to each other to call and say, hey Steve, how you doing today? Are you doing your workout? And just, you know, you might ask a person, if we're going to have this arrangement, how do you like to be contacted? Do you like to have me call you on the phone? Do you like to have text message? Do you like to have emails? And if you don't want me to call you, just tell me. But if we want to get past this thing, and the whole issue of wellness is a discipline and a time frame. It's the first week or so is kind of fun, it's easier, and then as you get further away from when you started this campaign, pretty soon you can say, oh, I can have a little bit of this because I'm past it. And it's maybe a month down here that a person starts to really need the support from somebody to say, hey, we're into our first time frame. Are we still, do we want to get to the end of it? Do we really want to finish the race? And again, life is not a short burst. It is a long-term run. And there are so many things, particularly in the culture that we live in today, that are reasons for us to say, oh, this is just not worth it. Just let me have something with sugar.
It's too hard. I'm busy. You know, I've got a packed schedule. Can't I just run through McDonald's drive-through? Can I just run in the convenience store and buy an energy bar? You know, wash it down with a cup of coffee. I'm just really busy, you know.
Mm-hmm. And those things are hurdles. But the long term is when we wind up with the statistics today that out of 1,000 people entering into this mess of life, only one at the age of 60 will pop out healthy. One.
Well, when you say healthy, I mean, that's a subjective term.
Free
of
prescription drugs.
That's a big definition of healthy.
Well,
I mean, I'd love to see that definition of healthy be a goal, to be living free of pharmaceuticals.
But there are many people who are really quite proud of how many pharmaceuticals they're on. It's kind of like the weather.
The victim mentality is a whole other discussion.
Okay.
I don't have to hike because I have high this or low that. I don't have to get up early or do this because I have this doctor prescribed issue. I don't have to go play with my kids in the park because I have hyper this or low that. Unfortunately, we become victim to those diagnoses, and we go victim instead of taking responsibility. Whole different discussion. I don't want to go down that road, but according to the Bible, there was, we were humans 2,000 years ago. We're humans now, and God created us all in His likeness. And why didn't they have such a high rate of depression back then? Why didn't they have such a high rate of heart disease back then? I mean, yeah, they were only living to 35 or 40 years old. Maybe that's it. Today we're living to 80 plus years old.
Well, you're asking about that, and I would suggest that you take a look at such things as, if you took everybody that's on pharmaceuticals off of those, how long would they live?
I don't know that they're...
Nobody wants to try it.
Well, and I think the doctors that take you off could get sued.
Okay, so the question is quality of life, and you just went through a diatribe of explanations of I can't do this because of, and here I am in my 70s, and my grandkids can look at me and say, Grandpa, let's run the mountains. Let's do it right now. And this is something that I could honestly say 20 years ago I couldn't do.
Right.
And it was a time dealing with the Hebrew word tem, which is the 8th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, that begins to talk about grace. But within that word of grace, there is some disciplines, because as you turn into, I think it's the 8th word, but it's in the Hebrews about, or excuse me, in Psalms 119, it's probably verse 59-ish, but it talks about, as I looked in the mirror, I looked at what I was doing and I turned my feet. Well, you can't, if you turn your feet, the rest of you have to go too. And I turned my feet to the principles of Torah, the instructions of Torah. It said, I didn't wait, I did not pause, I went immediately. And that was me. Some 20 years ago, I didn't do all of it at one time, but I looked at what I was doing and said, there's really something wrong with this picture. And I began to go back to the principles that I was raised under, the restoration time frame in my life. And I said, well, hey, this does not line up with, if I am a creationist, which I am, if God says when He finished building man, He was not really good, not good, He was really good, then why don't I just understand the principles and try to live by those?
So what are some of those principles?
Well, it really talks about, if you look at Daniel, it talks about the four of them at the table of the Persians and said, we'll feed you like our intellectuals of the time. And they said, let us eat our Hebrew diet and check our continence in 10 days. It's pretty short term. So in 10 days, they looked at them and they said, not only are they cleaner, they look brighter than the diet that their counterparts were eating, but they were smarter. In fact, if you get to the end of that first chapter in Daniel, it says not only that, but in 2 years, they knew 10 times what their counterparts knew. So not only is it a physical thing, but it's a mental thing.
So what are the four things that they were eating? What are we discussing?
Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and honey.
Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and honey. Okay.
And grains, but the grains were different. They weren't modified. So they had the grains. they ate very little meat. So they got their protein from the vegetable world and from the nut world, which begins to really take in a different thing. And I think they use goat milk.
Okay.
So goat milk is very unusual in relationship to the molecular structure of the fat. When we homogenize here, we rip that dairy hormone to death. But in the goat milk, it's already been homogenized and it stays in solution. And that is a principal form of the energy, because we as a human body, our ATP, our energy, comes from fat, not proteins, not carbohydrates. So when people begin to understand this, and again, we need to get people to understand that if information like this is real, and it is, they need to be able to call a friend, and without getting the biggest King James version that they can find and beating them up with it.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be able to learn how to ask good questions with a solution. It's one thing to point out a fault, it's another one to have a solution that is right, which is Proverbs.
Okay.
So if what we learned in Proverbs is a covenant which God made in Deuteronomy, if you will do this, I will do this. Now, if you choose not to do this, this is what I'm going to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's a covenant. I looked at that. One of the biggest words that jumped out at me, if you don't do this, this is what I'm going to create. And went through a list of things, but the word inflammation jumped out.
Mm.
Now, we didn't have a bunch of biochemists back there when the laws were being written, but the word inflammation is where disease lives.
We know that today.
We know that today. So they were told, and they believed, and they trusted. Those that didn't believe and didn't trust, they obviously came down with some diseases. So in our world, and in mine, I simply looked at it and said, why don't I try that? I've tried this side of the aisle for 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And look what it's gotten. And so I decided to change.
So describe yourself 50 or 20 years ago when you're in your 50s. That might, people may understand better the differences you feel today. So, they maybe quantify some of those things.
Well, a host of issues with arthritis, gout, not seriously overweight, but about 15 pounds, not very fit, couldn't run the mountains, and just kind of lethargic. Okay.
Lethargic is something that, people understand. I don't know that running the mountains is something that everyone else could comprehend. We in Western Colorado have the beauty of the mountains in our backyard. I don't run the mountains. I do enjoy hiking and walking the mountains, but I too, at 47 years old, do not yet run the mountains.
Well, the pleasure of that is incredible.
It's a beautiful place.
It is, and it's, I must tell you how it all happened to me. My kids are quite athletic, and I'm in my 70s. They said, "Dad, don't you be running in those mountains. Don't run downhill." All right. So I'm doing some of the treacherous trails, and you know where I'm referring to. And I caught my toe one day, and in catching up, I was running. And I started going, this kind of fun. Could I have done it without that? Was I looking forward to that? No. My son, Nate, we were back in the mountains. The three of us were hiking around. Someone said, he's probably never been back here. So I called him. Now, he's in his late 30s now. And I said, I described it. He says, oh, yeah. He says, you don't understand me. This is my son. And I said, how's that? And he said, I'm capable of going on a hike and running in the mountains 50 miles nonstop. I said, you got to be kidding. He said, no, I'm all over that place. Now, I looked and listened to that. And I played a lot of golf, played it well. And one day a friend of mine wanted a golf lesson. So he hauled out his tools, which were garden tools, called them golf clubs. And I said, we can't do this. And I went and got my bag, and it's pro line set. And we were whacking, there was a big difference. I said, Doug, they're yours. I quit. And after 40 years of playing golf as low as a one handicap, I gave it to him, and I ventured into the mountains, and I haven't gone back. So the change was from what used to be, what was accepted, of Stephen to go play golf with a host of guys and compete, was all at once in the mountains, where there were the sounds, the solitude, the peace, and yet the exertion is there. Which I've lived here forever, and I never did.
I mean, walking a golf course is exercise, more exercise than some of us get in a week or a day or a month. That's not one thing, but the exertion of hiking in the mountains is a little bit different. A lot of people wouldn't use the term exertion in golfing in the same sense.
It's hard. I mean, you really got to be sick. I heard one lady describing her exercise. It was getting in the bathtub, pulling the plug, and swimming upstream. So everybody's exercise level is different. I'm just suggesting to you that at the time in my life when I decided to change, it was incremental. Had I known the benefits of really making a change in a full onslaught, the difference it would have made when I was 50 rather than 5 years before I was 70 to really complete it, I would tell people that we need to do this when we're in the womb. It makes a significant difference.
When you say do this,
eat correctly.
Eat correctly.
You bet. Listen to quality music. Observe quality things. When I'm watching what's going on in the college programs today, it's despicable what they accept as norm. And we need to stand in the gap and say the lifestyle that you could enjoy is a lot different than the temporary enjoyment that you call enjoyment that you're getting in some of the festivities that are currently being on display. Okay?
My daughter goes into college next year. It's a very big concern for me because I think that the morals on campus are challenged. There's a lot of good Christian and other Bible-based groups and organizations, and I pray my daughter finds one and finds a home there because it does give some strength against what the norm is. But you mentioned there a lot of different things, and I think the discipline, one for me, there's 31 different proverbs, and there's 31 days in the month and 30 some months. And I personally choose to read and or listen to a proverb a day. Today's the 20th. The Proverb 20, thou shalt not drink wine and spirit, and on into, and this is something I've done, and I'm not very good at quoting Bible and verse yet, but I'm getting closer because I do spend time in the Word, and I understand what God has said in that book, and God has written through His disciples and through His prophets and through His people in that book. That is His wisdom for us and His knowledge for us. And the Bible can be misinterpreted, can be used against us in several ways. But if we, and me, I'm a Christian, I'm blessed that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and I have the discernment of the Holy Spirit in me to help me read the Bible. Somebody could say something and I might question it, I might agree with it, but I still need to jump into the Word to find it. So if you could give us some references and where in Deuteronomy and where in, you said the first chapter of Daniel, and I'm not expecting, exact verse numbers and that would be good as well. But where can we read in the Old Testament what God wants us? I mean, Proverbs, obviously, Psalms, there's great references, but there's 150 plus Psalms, and it's they're all good, but, David had a lot of trials in his life, and, always fell back on the Lord, and it was the Lord that saved him, and the Lord that gave him kingship and everything else.
That's all right. I would start, and let me suggest. I've been promising to do this now for 2 years, and with some help, I'm going to do it.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to do the Hebrew alphabet and the mezuzah, one or two maybe a week, in the description of how then should man live. Because you see in Psalms 119, it talks about how can a young man keep his ways pure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is such an interesting, because of purity of a lifestyle, they live an entirely different life. They do. You know, now I look back at all of the goofy things that I did. We won't get into it. But those memories, I have been forgiven of what I did, but those new memories linger on.
Mm-hmm.
Think about what you don't have to deal with if you lived a life in accordance with the way that my Yeshua Messiah wants us to live. And he talks about live by the precepts. Precepts are principles.
Mm-hmm.
Then it talks about the ordinances. Those are the instructions.
Okay. Precepts.
And he's laid them out for us in terms of diet, in terms of meditation. What are we supposed to think about? And if you'll walk with me in the coming months, I will give a distinct description in biblical principles of how then can we teach these principles to our children and to ourselves. We need to reconnect. We need to go back to that restoration period, because in restoration it means I'm going to return to you what you lost.
Mm-hmm.
That day.
and
you and I,
I
want to say this. You and I are in sales. Well, I'm trying to sell people on the principles of health. So if they feel pressured, but we want people to make that decision right then. Do we not?
Just like it said in Psalms, turn your feet now.
Today, do not wait and go. I did not wait. So we're talking to people about returning their health to them, or that they've lost today. But they have to be a receptor of those truths, and then they have to say, I want to do it.
Mm-hmm. So
they have to look at themselves and say, do I want to go into the next 10 years with what I've developed?
This tabernacle, this tent that we're given here on earth, is God's temple, and the Holy Spirit dwells within. And it might be nice to give him a home.
It would be. It's that compost pile that we're talking about.
Compared to me 5 years ago, over 300 pounds, smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, drinking plenty of beer and wine and other alcoholic beverages, I don't think I was a very good host to the Holy Spirit. But now that he is a focus for me, I'm glad that he's there. So going forward, we have to wrap this up, but going forward, do we want to use this Friday morning to go through the mezuzah one at a time? I mean, is that something that we can plan on this half an hour?
We can talk a little bit about it, but this is something that I really need to spend a lot of time. There are words in the mezuzah, in the letters of the Hebrew, that have incredible meanings, such as the second letter, which is bet. Bet is dualistic in that it talks about the spiritual side and the physical side, and that you are going to build on one side. In fact, the letter bet in Hebrew is the same word that we use for house. So where we are going to build a house that God wants to live in, right? Now, how are we going to do that? That's the important aspect of this whole thing. And what is it? And scripturally, and all of these things are letters and words that apply to a lifestyle that the vast majority of Americans have never listened to. Right. And they're working in a fuzzy world without direction. and they don't know what the truths are. Brother Paul, was asked what he was, and he said, I am a trust-obedient Messianic Jew. Ooh, that's pretty descriptive. And they must have got under his skin one day for him to lay it out like that. Although I'm a follower of Paul, and I really like this brother of ours that went before us. And somebody asked him, well, how can you trust that? He said, because the giver of the information is trustworthy. Who is a Messiah. So if he gave us these instructions, why can't we live by them? If the benefit is to walk with Christ, Messiah, not Messiah, why can't we do that? And the benefits of it are immeasurable.
Well, I strive to walk closer to those instructions every day, and I'm getting healthier and more vibrant every day as I do. Thank you, Stephen, for today, and we'll continue to talk about health and nutrition and vitality through the principles of the Bible and what the Lord, our God, has given us as direction, as discipline, and maybe some tools to get there. The accountability you mentioned earlier is a great way, a great tool for us to utilize to hold each other accountable and to be healthy, strong, vibrant servants.
Well, obesity is a huge problem in America today. It doesn't mean just physically. I think it means spiritually too.
Oh, well,
So
maybe that'll be our subject.
The thinner we get, the closer we get to God.
That's true. Can't get that close. Thank you, everybody. Have an awesome day. Have a blessed week, and we'll see you next Friday.